Hated at questions like that because the evidence is overwhelming that we went to the moon, as people just refuse to acknowledge it.
Charles Duke, the youngest man to ever walk on the moon, carried a secret for 50 years, a secret he buried beneath duty, silence, and the pride of Apollo 16. But now, with time running out, he admits what he saw on that barren surface, something no training, no mission plan, and no science could ever prepare him for.
That's just crazy.
This isn't just the story of a moon landing. It's the story of a confession that shakes everything we thought we knew about our nearest neighbor in space. The last great Highlands bet when Apollo 16 was put on the schedule. When Apollo 16 was placed on the schedule, NASA's planners knew this mission had to be different. The United States had already shown the world that astronauts could plant flags, collect rocks, and return safely from the moon. But Apollo 16 carried a higher purpose. It was not about proving machines worked. It was about pushing deeper into the mystery of the moon itself. Scientists believed that samples from the lunar highlands could finally answer one of humanity's oldest questions. How did the moon form, and what role did it play in Earth's history? Earlier Apollo missions had all landed on smoother plains called Maria. These flat areas were safer and easier to reach, but they did not hold the oldest rocks. The highlands were different. They were rugged, ancient, and thought to be the exposed bones of the moon's crust.
Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
The Descartes Highlands, the target for Apollo 16, had never been visited before. Some experts argued the region was volcanic. Others believed it was made of debris from massive impacts that had struck billions of years ago. Apollo 16 was the chance to solve that debate once and for all. But choosing the Highlands came with a steep cost. The landing site was full of hidden slopes, jagged ridges, and boulders that could crush the lunar module. The spacecraft carried only a small reserve of fuel for last-second corrections. A wrong move could mean crashing into the surface or tipping over on landing. Engineers worried that the lander might sink into deep dust or slide down an unseen incline. They rehearsed every scenario in countless simulations, but no test could capture the reality of setting down in such dangerous terrain.
I find myself now standing with my head on the floor when I get down at the limb.
Still, NASA accepted the gamble. With the Apollo program nearing its end, they might not get another chance. The weight of that decision fell heavily on Charles Duke, the youngest man to walk on the moon. He knew every second would matter. A small error in navigation, sample collection, or equipment handling could cost precious time, and time was life. Each moonwalk was a race against oxygen, battery power, and exhaustion. Duke and mission commander John Young understood that they were not just exploring. They were carrying the responsibility of showing that Apollo still had the power to deliver science worth the risk and cost of leaving Earth. But Apollo 16 was not only a story of landing on the Highlands. It was also about the three men who carried that risk on their shoulders. John Young, the commander, was already a legend at NASA. By 1972, he had flown on Gemini 3, orbited the moon on Apollo 10, and even smuggled a corned beef sandwich into space as a prank. He was calm, disciplined, and trusted completely. If anyone could guide the lunar module safely into the treacherous Descartes Highlands, it was John Young. Charles Duke, the lunar module pilot, was a contrast. At 36 years old, he was the youngest astronaut to set foot on the moon. His path to Apollo 16 had been marked by setbacks. While serving as backup crew for Apollo 13, he accidentally exposed his teammate Ken Mattingly to rubella. That forced NASA to replace Mattingly just days before launch. Duke carried the guilt of that moment, but it also gave him a second chance. By Apollo 16, he was determined to prove himself as a skilled astronaut who could deliver under pressure. Then there was Ken Mattingly, the command module pilot. If anyone understood the pain of bad timing, it was him. Losing his seat on Apollo 13 meant he also lost the chance to be remembered as part of the crew that survived one of history's greatest rescues. Apollo 16 was his redemption. While Young and Duke explored the surface, Mattingly would orbit the moon alone in the command module, Casper, ensuring his crewmates could return safely. His role was lonely but vital. What made this crew remarkable was not only their experience but their resilience. Each man had faced failure or frustration that could have ended his career.
Well, I was so excited, though I couldn't even pronounce tranquility. It came out twang. Roger twang, I corrected myself.
Instead, they returned sharper, stronger, and more determined. That sense of redemption bound them together. Their training was relentless, filled with long days of geology trips, endless simulator runs, and survival exercises that pushed them past exhaustion. Young demanded discipline. Duke brought energy. Mattingly delivered precision. Together, they balanced one another in a way that worked. NASA needed that balance, especially with the Apollo program winding down and public interest fading. The astronauts knew every sample, every test, and every minute on the surface mattered. Apollo 16 was more than a mission. It was proof that humanity's desire for answers could still overcome risk. But in the rush to collect data and chase history, something else happened, something no checklist could have predicted. Training for the unknown. For all the glory of walking on the moon, the road to Apollo 16 was built on sweat, repetition, and preparation for dangers no human had ever faced. Training was not glamorous. It was exhausting, relentless, and often discouraging. Yet without it, John Young, Charles Duke, and Ken Mattingly could never have survived, let alone turned Apollo 16 into one of the most ambitious missions in NASA's history. They were being asked to master machines on alien ground, collect valuable samples under brutal conditions, and do it all with the constant countdown of their life support ticking in the background.
Even though mission control by picking up moon rocks and setting up experiments, there was still enough time to take advantage of their unique view of Earth.
Training had to prepare them for the unknown. Much of that preparation focused on what could go wrong. NASA simulated everything: engine failures, rover malfunctions, communications blackouts, and even medical crises, such as a ruptured suit or a sudden illness. The astronauts drilled each scenario until their reactions became instinct. In one grim exercise, Duke had to practice what to do if Young collapsed during a moonwalk. Could he drag his commander back to the lunar module in reduced gravity while staying upright in a stiff suit? In another, they rehearsed how to continue the mission if the lunar rover failed to start. How far could they travel on foot before oxygen ran out? These what-if drills were draining, but they were the difference between life and death. The lunar rover itself was at the heart of much of the training. Unlike earlier crews, Young and Duke would not be limited to walking distance from the lander. The rover gave them freedom to explore miles across the highlands, but it also introduced new risks. If it broke down far from home, could they navigate back on foot? Could it handle the sharp slopes and deep craters of the Descartes region? Engineers built fake lunar landscapes on Earth, filled with rocks and ridges, to test the rover's limits. Duke and Young spent hours bouncing over these obstacles, learning how to control the machine in a world where gravity pulled with only 1/6 of Earth's strength.
Perhaps the most visually spectacular aspect of this mission was when the crew took their rover out to sites far beyond where they landed.
The rover could extend their reach, but it could also strand them in deadly isolation. Even the suits became part of the battlefield. They were marvels of engineering, able to protect against deadly heat, radiation, and vacuum, but they were also heavy and stiff. Imagine trying to pick up a pebble while wearing armor, thick gloves, and a helmet that narrowed your vision. Duke and Young practiced endlessly in those suits, lifting tools, swinging hammers, and bagging rocks until the moves became second nature. They learned how to conserve energy, how to squat without falling, and how to steady themselves in a place where even a stumble could become catastrophic. Geology, too, became central to their training. NASA wanted more than heroic photographs. They needed scientific discovery. Geologists trained the astronauts to read the land, to spot rocks shaped by volcanoes, to recognize signs of impacts, and to collect samples that could tell the moon's story. Field trips took them to craters in Arizona, lava fields in Hawaii, and impact scars in Canada. There, Duke practiced giving quick, precise descriptions over the radio, just as he would on the moon, his voice strained inside a helmet as his breath fogged the visor.
320, bearing 350, and range is 4.3.
The goal was to transform pilots into scientists who could bring home knowledge, not just rocks. But for all its detail, the training had one silent gap. They had prepared for dust, rocks, breakdowns, and even death. What they had not prepared for was the possibility of seeing something that did not belong. The moon, barren as it seems, still hides mysteries beyond geology. When Charles Duke later admitted he saw something strange moving across the lunar surface near the rover, it was not in any manual. It was not in any simulation. It was the kind of unknown no drill could ever prepare them for. Apollo 16 trained them to face every predictable danger. Yet Duke's secret describes something outside the boundary of prediction itself. Life on the moon. On April 20th, 1972, after days drifting through the emptiness of space, Apollo 16's lunar module, Orion, touched down on the rugged highlands of Descartes. The landing was smooth, but what greeted Charles Duke and John Young was anything but peaceful. Spread before them was a battlefield of stone, jagged craters, towering boulders, and gray dust that clung like ash to everything it touched. When Duke stepped out and felt the lunar ground beneath his boots, his voice cracked with disbelief.
Okay, fuel is good, 10%. That comes the shadow. Perfect place over here, John. A couple of big boulders.
I'm on the moon. I'm really on the moon. The first excursion lasted more than 7 hours. Every rock, every scoop of soil was a relic of cosmic history. For Duke, it was not just science. It was standing at the birthplace of worlds. Then came history's first drive across the moon. The lunar rover, fragile in appearance, seemed like a toy in the vast wilderness. But when Young fired it up, the moon opened wide before them. Instead of pacing a small patch near their landing site, they now roamed miles into uncharted territory. The rover bounced lightly in the weak gravity, tossing dust into glittering arcs that drifted slowly back down. They traveled more than 3 miles on that first drive. By the third day, they had gone farther than any crew before them, climbing hills, crossing craters, and hauling back over 200 pounds of lunar rock and soil. Some of these samples would later prove that the moon was once alive with fire, scarred by ancient volcanic eruptions. But life on the moon was grueling. The suits were heavy, movement was awkward, and even the simplest tasks drained their strength. Still, they pressed on. At night, cramped inside the lunar module, they gazed at a horizon untouched by time. To the world, Apollo 16 was a flawless success, a mission of science, discovery, and triumph. Yet for Charles Duke, it was also the moment he carried a secret he could not explain. Because in the silence, when everything seemed ordinary, he saw something that should not have been there. A flicker, a shadow, a movement that felt alive. For only a heartbeat, it darted past the rover and vanished into the endless gray. Duke froze. Was it a trick of light, dust on his visor, or had something truly moved across the barren landscape of the moon? He said nothing to John Young. He buried the thought, but inside, he knew it had not been an illusion. It was too quick, too deliberate. It was a presence. For 50 years, Duke kept silent. To history, Apollo 16 was another triumph. But to him, it was the mission where he looked into the void and the void looked back. The reason he stayed silent for 50 years. When Charles Duke returned to Earth, he carried back more than 200 pounds of lunar rock and soil. But there was another weight no one else could see. An image burned into his memory, a fleeting shadow on the moon that defied explanation. For half a century, he told no one. Why? Because the timing could not have been worse. In 1972, NASA was struggling to keep its funding alive. The Apollo program was winding down, and skeptics were already circling, ready to call the moon landings a hoax. If Duke had stood before the world and said, "I saw something out there," the fallout could have been catastrophic. His reputation, NASA's credibility, even America's triumph in the space race might have crumbled overnight. And then there was NASA's culture. Astronauts were trained to be warriors of reason, disciplined, rational, unshakable. They were not supposed to speak of moving shadows, strange flickers, or mysteries that pointed to something beyond human understanding. To do so risked ridicule, or worse, the end of a career. So Duke stayed silent. He told himself it was fatigue, a trick of light, dust on his visor. He buried it beneath duty, family, and the pride of Apollo 16. But silence has a weight of its own. With each passing decade, that memory pressed harder against his conscience. What if the cameras had caught it? What if the evidence was still hidden in reels of lunar footage, waiting to be uncovered? And what if his silence meant humanity had missed a vital piece of the moon's story? For 50 years, he carried that question. And at last, the burden became too heavy. Charles Duke, the youngest man ever to walk on the moon,
The walk on the moon lasted 3 days, but the walk with Jesus lasts forever.
finally chose to speak, not just for himself, but for history. The review of the Apollo 16 footage. For years, Charles Duke tried to push the memory aside. He told himself it was exhaustion, a trick of the mind after endless hours inside a heavy suit on alien soil. But silence does not erase memory. It only sharpens it. The image of that shadow, quick and deliberate, clung to him like a dream that refused to fade. Decades later, as technology advanced and Apollo footage was digitized in higher clarity, Duke could no longer ignore the question that gnawed at him. What if the cameras had seen what I saw? At last, he made the request. The Apollo 16 archives held hundreds of hours of grainy film from the lunar rover, the module, and the astronauts themselves. Every bounce of the rover's wheels, every stumble in low gravity, every stretch of the highlands was preserved, and hidden within those reels was the moment Duke had buried for 50 years. When the footage was played back, it was no longer just his memory. There it was. Movement, not a trick of light, not static on the film. A dark shape gliding across the lunar horizon with impossible speed. Duke froze as he watched. this was not just a blur. It had scale. Against the rover, which stretched 10 feet in length, the figure appeared enormous, perhaps even larger. And then, just as suddenly, it vanished. No dust, no trail, only questions. In that instant, half a century of silence shattered. The thing he had doubted, denied, and buried deep inside was carved into film for all to see. He had not imagined it. He had seen something real on the moon. For Charles Duke, Apollo 16 would never again be remembered only as a triumph of science and exploration. It had become something else, the mission where he alone witnessed a mystery that even now defies explanation. Scientific hypotheses and skepticism. When Charles Duke finally revealed his secret, the world did not respond with universal belief. Instead, it triggered a wave of debate. Scientists, engineers, and skeptics rushed to explain away the mystery. After all, if a veteran astronaut claimed to have witnessed a massive moving shape on the moon, then either the moon was not what we thought it was, or Duke's own eyes had betrayed him. The first explanations leaned on the familiar. Some argued it was nothing more than an optical illusion. On the moon, sunlight is raw and merciless. With no atmosphere to soften it, shadows fall so sharp they can look like solid objects. A small change in perspective can transform a simple rock into something that appears alive. Could Duke have mistaken a sliding shadow for a moving presence? Others pointed at the cameras. The lunar rover's equipment was primitive compared to modern technology. Static, dust, or a mechanical hiccup could easily create a strange blur on the footage. To skeptics, this seemed the most reasonable answer, an artifact of the machine, not a living thing. Yet even the doubters struggled with one troubling fact: the size. According to Duke, the shape was nearly as large as the rover itself, around 10 feet long and 7 feet wide, and it moved with deliberate speed. Shadows do not run. Dust does not glide. Glitches do not scale themselves perfectly against the hardware sitting beside them. A more daring hypothesis suggested it might have been debris ejected from the lunar module, silently tumbling across the surface. But this idea quickly unraveled. The Apollo 16 logs recorded no such event, and no equipment was ever reported missing. And then came the whispers. If the moon harbors lava tubes, quakes, and magnetic anomalies, could it also hide forces beyond our understanding? Some speculated about extraterrestrial presence, others about strange lunar phenomena buried in the highlands. For every skeptic armed with a rational dismissal, there were believers who saw Duke's account as a crack in the armor of certainty. After all, the moon has never been just a rock in the sky. It has always been a mirror for human imagination, a stage where mystery thrives. And now, Charles Duke's confession, spoken by an astronaut, a soldier, and a man trained to face the unknown, left behind one haunting possibility. What if Apollo 16 was not just a mission of exploration, but the first human brush with something we were never meant to find? The psychological and spiritual impact on him. When astronauts return from the moon, they never come back the same. Staring at Earth from 250,000 miles away, a fragile blue marble hanging in infinite black has a way of stripping away illusions. For Charles Duke, that transformation cut deeper than anyone imagined. Apollo 16 was supposed to be a triumph, a scientific conquest. Officially, he was the man who brought back 200 pounds of lunar rock and helped push the frontier of human knowledge. But privately, he carried something else, a shadow that haunted him like a ghost. Some astronauts, like Buzz Aldrin and Edgar Mitchell, spoke openly about spiritual awakenings after their missions. Duke's path was similar, but heavier. The emptiness of the moon, combined with the unexplainable shape he had witnessed darting across its surface, cracked something inside him. Science could not contain it. Logic could not bury it. The hunger for meaning grew louder. By the late 1970s, Duke began to look beyond geology and engineering, turning instead to faith. He spoke of rediscovering God, of realizing that humanity wasn't just reaching for stars of rock and dust, but for something higher, something eternal. And always, buried beneath his words, lingered the secret, the glimpse of a massive, impossible presence on the lunar surface. For decades, he carried that silence. He smiled for interviews, spoke at schools, and stood as the charming Southern gentleman, always the astronaut, never the witness. But truth presses against the walls we build around it. And after half a century, Charles Duke could no longer contain his. In a rare, unguarded confession, he spoke. He had seen it. A shape, massive and swift, darting past the lunar rover in 1972. It was not one of us, he admitted. It was not a trick of the light. I should have spoken long ago. The reaction was instant and divided. Some dismissed him as delusional, a man worn down by age. Others accused him of chasing attention. But to believers in the unexplained, the revelation was explosive. This was not a conspiracy theorist. This was an Apollo astronaut, a man who had been there, driven across the dust plains, and touched the alien soil himself. His confession did not rewrite the textbooks, but it reignited a question humanity cannot escape. What truly lies beyond what we can measure? If even the most disciplined of explorers, bound by NASA's silence and trained in science, carried such a secret for 50 years, what else might remain untold? For Charles Duke, it was never about convincing the world. It was about unburdening himself before time ran out. Apollo 16 would forever be remembered not just as a mission of triumph, but as the moment where one man saw something humanity still cannot explain. What do you think he actually saw? Was it just a trick of the light, a glitch in the cameras, or something far more unsettling waiting in the shadows of the moon? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries from beyond our world.